Welcome everyone to the first session, the all-Canadian session. Glad that Mark invited me. Initially, I thought it was because of my background in tracking data, but clearly it's just because I'm Canadian. And remarkably though, not a single talk is about hockey or lacrosse. So excited to see all this work. So our first speaker is Sam Gregory, who's currently Director of Analytics for Inter Miami, prior to which he's held positions at York United, Opta, and Sportlogic. He's also working towards his master's degree at Victoria University, studying the intersection of sports science and analytics in soccer. His talk is entitled Pace and Power, Removing Unconscious Bias from Sports Analytics Conferences. Oh, sorry, I mean soccer broadcasts. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Luke. I'm just gonna try and, I think someone needs to let me share my screen.
Done. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you should be able to now.
Let's go present mode. There we go. Everyone can see all right?
That's good.
All good?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So as Luke mentioned, I'm Sam Gregory, and I'm presenting a paper today called Pace and Power, Removing Unconscious Bias from Soccer Broadcasts. This is a paper that I worked on with Devin Pluler, Daniel Dali-Grafstein, Yang Liu, and Paul Marchwika in collaboration with Sportlogic. Now, before I get started, I just want to kind of give two quick caveats. The first is this is actually a paper that we wrote back in 2019. And due to various things in the pandemic, we weren't able to present it until today. So I'm really excited to have the chance to present it today. But some of the things are a little out of date. Just the games are mostly from 2018 and 2019 that we'll be talking about. And also the technology that I'll be showing from Sportlogic was sort of their state of the art back in 2019. So it will have inevitably improved since then. And the second is sort of going off what Mark and Scott were talking about in the introduction, which is this is a paper looking at gender bias and racial bias in professional sports. And it's written by, co-authored by 5 men, most of whom are white. And I think as we criticize like media companies, scouting, and sort of the racial and gender bias that exists in these in sports in general, it's important to kind of point out our own weaknesses. And this is definitely something we should have done better, but I think it's just important to say before I get started. So here we go. So this paper takes its name from an expression, pace and power, which if you've ever watched a soccer broadcast before, I'm sure you've heard this. Just refers to players who are strong, powerful, and quick. But a lot of people have noticed that this particular phrase, pace and power, is used disproportionately to refer to Black players. There's an article here looking at a game in the 2018 World Cup where Senegal beat Poland, and almost the entire focus was around sort of the athletic and physical prowess of the Senegal, a team made up of entirely Black players, much more than sort of their creativity, intelligence, things like that. And Paul Pogba is another player who's often been sort of, he's midfielder for Manchester United, generally considered to be one of the best midfielders in the world, very creative player, intelligent player, dynamic. And he's also is certainly a powerful player, and he has a quick turn of pace. But there's been a lot of focus on his pace and power over some of the other attributes I mentioned, which lots of people have sort of highlighted as a potential racial bias in terms of how we analyze him specifically, but also Black players in general. And so I think it's important to say this idea that we're going to be talking about in this paper today, it's not something new. I mean, lots of people have pointed out, and there's been a lot of research on racial bias in sports. And lots of people pointed out that Black players tend to be highlighted more for their athletic qualities rather than their skill or work ethic, things like that, which white players tend to be highlighted for more often. So the research that I've highlighted here goes back to 2001, but there's research that goes way further back on racial bias in professional sports. And so there's research here that mentions essentially what I just talked about in both college basketball and also soccer. There's a popular soccer fan, which an analysis comments about physicality were twice as likely to be made about Black players than white players. And it's also important to say this isn't just a media problem. This is a problem that pervades into actual analysis within professional teams. So looking at NFL draft quarterback profiles, there was an analysis done which found that actually the race of a player was a better indicator of whether that player's weight would be mentioned in the draft profile than the actual weight of the player, which is pretty surprising when you think that if the player's weight was worth mentioning, it's probably because of the weight, but it was found that the actual race of the player was a much better indicator of whether that would be mentioned in the profile. So it's all this is to say, this is an area where there's been a lot of research, where there is a kind of a growing consensus around the way that race, one of the ways that race really affects how we analyze professional sport. The other thing we're going to be talking about today is gender bias. Particularly in soccer, this has become a huge issue with the gender wage gap. I think the US women's national team has done a really good job of sort of highlighting this and bringing it to a higher level of discussion than it had been before. So this is a stat from 2017, which showed that Neymar's salary at PSG was higher than the salaries of all the players in the top 7 women's leagues combined. And the reason that we're going to be talking kind of about this specifically is one of the arguments that's often made to sort of defend this gender pay gap is that the quality in play is so different that people are more likely to want to watch a men's game than a women's game because the quality of play, fans will gravitate to that quality of play. And this is an idea that we're going to try and challenge in this paper. So the way that we're doing this is by using computer vision. One of the problems, or not a problem, but one of the things with all of the research that's been done so far in this area is it's looking at the same videos or the same games that every single person is looking at, which means that there's an argument to be made. Okay, well, if you say that more comments about athleticism tend to be made about Black players, the counter argument, which I think is kind of problematic in itself, would be, well, maybe Black players just are more athletic or are more physical. And so we're going to use computer vision to sort of challenge that idea. So what we do is we take a regular soccer broadcast. So on the right, you have it's just a still from a game from an NWSL game, a championship game in 2019. And we've converted it to a broadcast, to a broadcast render. So in the broadcast render, you can see sort of exactly what's happening. But you don't have any physical identifying characteristics about the players. You can't see the stands or anything like that. So you just see, okay, this is a dark blue team versus a light blue team, and the dark blue team has possession. So I just want to give you a bit of a taste of sort of what this looks like in practice. This is actually one of the clips that we used in a survey, which I'll mention a bit later in the presentation. So as you can see, you can follow what's happening. I mean, you can see that the dark blue team is attacking. There are issues with it, right? It's not perfect. So as the ball goes in the air, we lose the ball sometimes. And it's worth saying this is entirely unedited. So this is just kind of from an automated pipeline that takes broadcast video and turns it into these 2D recreations. But you're able to tell body pose, you're able to tell possession, you're able to tell what players are doing with the ball, what feet they play a pass with. So here, I think in this clip, you're about to see a very nice through ball being played. Yeah. So again, these are things that like you can identify clearly. You can follow this game like you would follow watching any other soccer game. So this isn't a computer vision paper, so I don't want to go too far in depth into sort of how we create these renders. But there's a lot of papers that SportLogic have released at various different conferences which go in depth into this process. Just as an overview, this is sort of how the pipeline works. So the first step is video segmentation. So you have a full broadcast, which includes replays, which includes close-ups. And for the purposes of tracking in these broadcast renders, all we care about is the main cam segments. So what we have to do is remove any replays, any close-ups, anything that's essentially not camera one. So we do that, that's automatically done. The process can identify these segments. Then we try and detect the objects that we're interested in. So in this case, we're interested in kind of 4 classes of objects: the referee, the home team, the away team, and the ball. So we draw essentially what it does, it'll draw a boundary box around each of these players and identifies where they are on the broadcast screen. Then there's 2 steps. So the next step is team identification. So once we've identified that this is an object we're interested in, we have to classify whether it's the referee, the ball, the home team, or the away team, which is done just essentially by feeding it jersey information. So you feed the model, these are the jerseys that you should be looking for, and it will spit out what the object that's been detected is. And then the next thing is the pose information. So if we go back to the video for a second, you'll see that I think if you've seen tracking data before, you'll probably be familiar with the 2D dots. So it's just, you'll see the pitch sort of flat and a player will be represented by a dot moving around. But to really recreate the broadcast, we need body pose. So what we do is we identify a series of points on the player. So we have both feet, both knees, the torso, the neck, shoulders, elbow, hands, and head. And then we can recreate the actual player themselves. So that's essentially how the pose estimation works. And then the one other step is camera calibration. So when we collect this data, it's essentially on a 2D, it's on the broadcast screen, so we know where that player is in the broadcast screen. But to recreate the image properly, we need to know where they are on the football field. So using the lines of the pitch that we see, we can sort of project this player onto a real world coordinate space, or onto a pitch coordinate space, by identifying where the camera is, how close the zoom is, what the angle of the camera is. And again, it's still done the same pipeline. So this pipeline uses a convolutional neural net based architecture and a PTZ model to make the generated template smooth and stable. And again, there's much more information if you're interested in sort of how this computer vision pipeline works. So what we did using these 2D renders is we used just essentially survey data to analyze these biases that we were looking at. We had a group of respondents who were split up into two groups because of response rates. We had slightly different. We had 58 responses who saw the 2D renders and 47 who saw the original video broadcasts. And we showed them 3 different videos. So all these clips were about 2 minutes long from these 3 different games. The first was the NWSL Championship in 2019. The second was English League 2, which is the 4th division in England. So these are 2 games with the same scoreline, about 4-0 wins. And asked them to compare these 2. And then the third video was the 2018 World Cup group stage, which I already mentioned this game in the introduction, just looking at, this was one of the games that became a touch point for the pace and power argument. And this game was between Senegal, a team of entirely black players, and Poland, a team of entirely white players. And so half of the respondents would receive the real broadcast video and half the 2D renders. And the questions that we asked them were identical across the 2 groups, except for a few quality control questions that we gave to the group that had the renders, just to make sure they could follow what was happening in the play. So we were basically looking at 2 different hypotheses. The first was gender bias in assessment of quality of play. So in these questions, we were asking people to compare video 1, which was the NWSL Championship game, to the English 4th division game. And the reason we chose these 2 leagues, so the NWSL is the top division of women's soccer in the United States. And in 2019, when we did this analysis, the average salary was a little more than a quarter of the average salary in the English 4th division. But the average attendance was higher in the women's league than the English 4th division. So the argument of fan interest really didn't come into play. If you were to kind of justify this pay gap, the argument would have to come down to what we talked about earlier, which is quality of play. And this is something that we wanted to challenge to see, could people actually tell the difference in quality of play once we remove these physically identifying characteristics? The second hypothesis was racial bias in assessment of style of play. So for this, these questions were just based on the 1 video, which was the Poland-Senegal game. And we asked a series of tactical kind of assessment questions and which team exhibited these characteristics more. So before we get to the results, one of the questions we asked at the start was, how much of a soccer fan are you on a scale from 1 to 10? And I want to show this just to kind of show that, I mean, when you work in sports, a lot of the people you have access to for these types of questions tend to be sports fans. So we had a big portion of our respondents identified as a 10 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 soccer fans. So we had a lot of quote unquote big fans or top tier fans. So looking at comparing the NWSL game to the English 4th division game, we found that when people saw the render, so this is with no physically identifying characteristics, the computer vision version, 59% of respondents said the NWSL game was of a higher quality. But when people saw the video, only 43% identified the women's game as being of a higher quality. Now, this result is not statistically significant at even a 10% level. So I think it's important to say we can't rule out the null hypothesis that the perception of quality of play was indifferent between people who saw the render and people who saw the video. But there's some evidence here that people are more likely to say that the game is of higher quality when they can't identify the gender of the players involved. And one thing we kind of thought about this study is it's quite a direct kind of question for the people who saw the renders wouldn't have really understood what we were getting at. But the people who saw the video, even though we didn't give any, we didn't sort of caveat what we were looking for or what the study was for, it was just given without kind of context. People, I'm sure, would have started to examine their own biases a little bit when you're asked to compare a women's game to a men's game. And we didn't really have a great kind of solution to this problem where you're asking people who are watching video to kind of say, do you think this men's game is better or this women's game? So I think that's one thing just to point out. Whereas in our second study, my guess is this was less of a problem. When you're just asking tactical questions, it's probably a little less loaded from a bias perspective in terms of what people expected. So looking at the second study, so we asked 4 questions. We asked which of the 2 teams was more athletic, more organized, more physical, and more technically skilled. The first thing I want to look at is essentially the 3 more physical, more technically skilled, and more organized. What stands out right away is how similar the people who saw the render answered to the people who saw the video. And I think this is sort of good news for the computer vision side of this, that people really are able to pick out the same tactical characteristics from a game when they're seeing the render as opposed relative to the actual broadcast video itself. So 50% of respondents said Poland were more physical when they saw the render. It was 45% in the video. 60% said they're more technically skilled in the render, 64% in the video. 72% said they're more organized from the render, 87% in the video. The one area where we saw a big disagreement between people who saw the render and the video was which team are more athletic. So 62% of respondents said Poland was the more athletic team when they had no physically identifying characteristics about the players. So all they could tell was, again, it was a light blue team versus a dark blue team from those 2D skeletons. But 70% of people said that Senegal were the more athletic team once they could see the race of the players and all these other physically identifying characteristics about the players. And this result is statistically significant at even a 1% level. So we've done a home CDAC adjustment here on these results for multiple hypothesis testing, just so that we're not accused of kind of p-hacking, but this is a highly significant result. So we see that people are much more likely to say that we're much more likely to say that Senegal, the team of entirely Black players, were more athletic when they could identify physical characteristics about that team. So before, I just want to get into the conclusions now a bit and some of the limitations of the study. So as I mentioned before, we had 105 people respond, which was a relatively homogeneous group. So we had lots of soccer fans, mostly men. If we wanted to expand the study, I think we would probably look at trying to diversify this group of respondents a bit, not just within gender lines or whatever, but also within how much of a soccer fan people are. Secondly, is the clips were picked mostly at random because we wanted to have, we didn't want to sort of push the respondents in any way, but they're relatively short. They're only about 2 minutes long each. We figured if we gave the respondents 90-minute videos of full games for each of these games, we would have much fewer responses than 105. But it really, that is how you want to do it. Eventually, you want to show people the entire game and make them sit down and watch 90-minute games. And the clips were picked, I say mostly at random because we didn't want to push people in any direction, but we wanted to make sure the computer vision was an accurate representation of what was happening. So these 2D renders were essentially doing a good job. Might introduce some sort of bias in that sense, but I doubt it. And then obviously the CD technology is very good, but it's not perfect. You saw issues with the ball going in the air. There are some things where players jump a little bit here and there, but I can't imagine this being too much of an issue. And I think, again, when you look back to these results and look at how people were able to identify the same tactical characteristics across these 3 different, across the other 3 variables, it suggests that people really were able to follow what was going on. And the other thing is that all of this work is sort of based upon gender and racial bias, but there may be other sources of bias here. So essentially what we've done is we removed all the physically identifying characteristics of the players, but also of the stadium, of everything around the game, even like the scoreboard, things like that, that we thought might have an issue or might have an impact. But yeah, so there could be other issues. But I think what sort of suggests that we have highlighted something that we're pretty sure reflects gender or racial bias is that it backs up the literature almost perfectly. And yeah, that's essentially the first conclusion, is that what we've done is we haven't proven anything new that that racial bias exists in sports or that people might be biased by gender. But what we've done is we've said, these are the results that these are the analyses that have been done in the real world looking at racial and gender bias. Can we identify these same things with a control group? And does that effect go away when people can't tell the gender and race of the players involved? And the answer is essentially yes. at least in these two cases, we found that, especially when we're talking about race, people were much more likely to say that a group of Black players were more athletic than a group of white players than they were when they couldn't, during the exact same video clip, when they couldn't tell the race of the players involved. So this is a pretty significant finding. And I think it provides a template going forward for challenging these beliefs. So as I mentioned before, like one of the things that people sometimes will say about these studies looking at racial bias is that, oh, well, they almost are defensive in a way and say, oh, maybe Black players are just more athletic. And this sort of suggests that's not the case, that that's not what people are seeing when they're watching a broadcast, that they can't tell any identifying features of the players. And so what I think this does is it gives us a template to challenge our own beliefs and challenge the way that scouts look at games, the way that coaches look at games, and the way that media analyze these games. So obviously, as a scout, you wouldn't want to replace watching the video with watching one of these renders yet. It's not up to that level of detail that you get with the video. But you might get more insight into sort of your own biases if, as a scout, maybe you try watching one game with a render and see if you come to any different conclusions. And if you do, analyze kind of within yourself, why do you come to these different conclusions? What is it that is causing this source of bias? And I think people will find that race is one of the big things that impacts sort of how we view players and how we watch players. And it's important to say this is not just like this has real world effects. This isn't just some issue that's sort of out there, but it affects the way that players are recruited. It affects the way that we coach players, the way that players are sort of streamlined into different positional groups or into different archetypes of a player. This has real world effects. And when you think about the media, it's even kind of more of a serious issue, or it might reflect how young athletes think about themselves because of the way that people they look up to or people who look like them are discussed in the media. So I think it's really important to say this isn't just, this type of research can have kind of real world applications. And this type of racism and sexism essentially has real world consequences to athletes, to coaches, to media, to across kind of professional sport and beyond professional sport in general. So I hope that this is kind of a tool to challenge these stereotypes going forward. And before I finish, I just want to thank, firstly, the entire AI computer vision team at SportLogic. So Yang and Paul are listed as co-authors on this paper from this team, but the pipeline itself was built by many more people than them. So yeah, I want to thank the AI computer vision team, Emer and David, who were data analysts at SportLogic and helped sense check some of the survey design stuff, Luke Bourne, who helped guide the project in some of the initial stages, and Ruby and Melanie, who helped with the survey logistics. So yes, that is it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Sam. Great talk. For those in the audience, feel free to ask questions via sort of two different formats. You can either raise your hand or just type it right into the Q&A. Sam, are you able to see the Q&A to answer them directly, or do you want me to read them out again?
Yes.
Should probably read them out loud anyway.
Yeah, so the first question is just to confirm, did all viewers watch the same or different 2-minute video clips? So it was the same, except for the fact that one was broadcast and one was the 2D renders. 2 minor questions. The dark blue team was hard for me to see against the field. Why not use something like red instead? That's a fair question. And no, we didn't randomize which team. So one team, I can't remember which is dark blue and which is light blue, but one is the home team and one is the away team. Yeah, and I know like colors are, especially with colorblind, trying to be friendly to colorblind viewers. I know colors can have a significant effect. So no, that's not something we actually looked at, but I think it's a good point. And then there's questions in the chat.
And people, if you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom and we can call on you in case you wanted to actually say something live, we can do that.
Yeah, I don't know if I see any other questions in the chat, but
Sam, in that case, I have one more question for you. So one thing you see in clubs a lot is using scouts, or essentially using eyes to detect athleticism. And one thing that you see really clearly from your analysis is that this is going to cause potentially massive biases. I'm wondering if you would have, for those who don't have access to broadcast data, how you might suggest a club enact policy or enact process which would help remove some of these biases?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is broadcast tracking itself, I think, is kind of the answer to this going forward. Obviously, we want to analyze our own biases, whether they be racial biases or other biases, but I think it's just a really hard thing to figure out. I even find, so again, my role is at Inter Miami. I have access to Second Spectrum, which is sort of an in-stadium tracking technology. So this isn't from the broadcast, this is from 6 camera installs, and they're super accurate at identifying player speeds and things like that. And I find even that sometimes my eye can deceive me. So there's players who I'll watch a game and think that they had super fast, high top speeds. And then when you look at the data, it's really because maybe they were quicker to react to something. So I think the answer is kind of twofold. One is that you have to know exactly what you're looking for, because top speed is not necessarily that thing. And the other is, I think broadcast tracking is sort of the way to really fight these biases.
Makes sense. We did have a hand raised from Craig.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question, Sam, about maybe I missed it in the talk, but how you determined the response, not who responded, but who received the survey. Like you mentioned that you knew some of the people. Was it all of them were handpicked or colleagues, or was there ever like a wide, blast sent to casual fans or even non-soccer fans in general?
It was a group of people who were connected to SportLogic in some way. So everyone had, some connection to SportLogic. But we were very careful about making sure that what we were doing stayed in a small group.
Gotcha.
I see a couple more questions in the Q&A. So from Barbara, I forgot what you mentioned, the response was mostly men. Yes, they were mostly men. And again, this is something we actually didn't collect. Did we collect? No, again, this is in 2019. In the paper, there isn't a difference between, we don't analyze any difference in respondents between men and women, I think because the number of women we had who responded was quite low. But yeah, that's certainly something that we could see. One difference which we did get into the paper, which I didn't in the presentation, was the difference between how much people identified as like a soccer fan. We found that when people saw the renders, there was no difference in how soccer fans answered questions to non-soccer fans. When people saw the video, we found that soccer fans were much more likely to, well, not much more likely, they were slightly more likely to essentially say good things about Senegal. And we wondered how much of that, we asked people to only base their opinion on the 2-minute clip. But we wondered how much of that was like Sadio Mane played for Senegal, who's one of the best players in the world. And if someone was a soccer fan, they might be more likely to kind of attribute good things to him, even though in the 2-minute clip that we showed, he didn't really do anything that spectacular. But that was one difference we saw, was that maybe people who identified as big soccer fans were more likely to bring what they knew about the players into the discussion. I've got a question from Nathan. Have you guys wrapped everything up with this project, or is there thoughts of doing it again with a bigger sample size? We definitely would like to do more. Again, it's kind of the logistics around this were a bit strange because we finished it basically at the end of 2019. We're ready to go do a bigger job with it, and then the pandemic hit, and we sort of hadn't touched it until coming back to it for this NESSIS presentation. So it's definitely something that I'm personally passionate about. I know all the co-authors are passionate about. So I think, yeah, we would like to do something bigger with it in the future, but there's no real plans right now for expanding it.
Sam, there's one last question in the chat, which you may not see, from SAP, which says, are certain positions in soccer more biased towards a certain racial group, like in American football?
Yeah, so this is something that we actually, I was discussing with some colleagues at Inter Miami, was because there definitely are positions that where there are certain racial groups are overrepresented. And we were wondering about kind of how early this bias takes place. So for example, there's a lot more Black players who are wingers than central midfielders. And so that's one of the things when we talk about Pogba as a central midfielder, he's kind of typecast as the pace and power guy, when we know that he brings a lot more than just that. And we were discussing whether we think, is that something that exists because of this bias, that they're kind of pushed into those positions at younger ages because people perceive them to have the characteristics that would make them better wingers. So whether that's, again, their speed, they can beat a man one-on-one, and then you develop into a better winger if that's sort of what you're typecast as younger. I remember, I think Daryl Morey talked about in the first few years after Steph Curry really started to dominate in the NBA, he saw more and more mixed race kids who would come to him and say, oh, I'm a long range shooter. And that was sort of what because they saw themselves in someone who had that skill set. And I'm sure the same happens in other sports where people, if you see yourself in professional players who do a certain role, you're more likely to gravitate towards doing that role yourself. So I'm sure it exists. Yeah.
All right, one last question here in the Q&A from Kat. I don't know if you can see it there.
Is it possible that the viewers who are major fans of soccer managed to recognize the games, thus impacting their biases? I think this would be almost impossible. It was like a 2-minute clip. No one scored. We did this in, again, late 2019. This was a game from the 2018 World Cup. We were really clear with people that they should do this by themselves. So like they shouldn't share the video. So I would have been absolutely shocked if anyone could have figured out that that was a 2-minute clip from that game that we showed. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sam. Really, really great talk. I hope more people run with these kind of ideas and pursue this line of work. Fascinating stuff.